The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $50, and the loudest man on the lot laughed at him in front of the whole crowd. Harlan Voss did not laugh back. He just lowered his hand, the bid already his, and looked up at what he had bought, a great dead heap of black iron squatting off by itself at the edge of the salvage lot, a massive stationary steam engine. Its long cast cylinder and its heavy bedplate gone black with grime, the great spoked flywheels seized solid, and the piston rod frozen dead in the crosshead ways. 10 tons of cold iron standing silent where the wrecking crew had dropped it. The demolition men had dragged it out of a one-family mill they were leveling and shoved it to the far fence. And 100 pickers had walked past it as too heavy to move and too dead to bother with, so plainly finished that the crowd read it as nothing but scrap iron and a wrenched back. Harlan had just paid $50 to own it, seized flywheel and dead piston and 10 tons of grime and all. It was a bright, clear Saturday morning, the kind of hard light that comes off a gravel yard at the end of summer. At a demolition and estate salvage sale in the fenced lot of a wrecking company on the edge of a small county town. Harlan was 73 years old, lean and a little stooped now, but sure in the hands, with a deeply lined face gone soft and weathered, close-cropped white hair under a flat cap, wire spectacles pushed up his nose, and pale, patient eyes that took their time. His hands were broad and careful, the fingers still steady the way a man stays steady when he has spent a life setting heavy things running true. He had worked that trade in his young years, a stationary engineer and an engine man, the one the mills and the waterworks sent for when a great steam engine threw a bearing or a governor hunted. The one who could bring a dead engine back onto its center under his own hand until the small mills closed and the steam trade went the way of the cheap current and the package motor that starved it, and the old men who could set an engine by feel were quietly closed out. He had made his living since as a picker and a junk man. But the iron never left him. The man who laughed was Dale Carrick, who ran the biggest salvage and scrap yard in 3 counties, a heavy-set man of about 55 in a loud cherry-red windbreaker he wore to be seen in, his face clean-shaven and ruddy, a thick gold ring on one hand and a stub of a cigar in the other. $50, Dale said, loud, so the whole lot could hear it. $50 for a dead mill engine that won't even turn, junk man. The flywheel seized, the rods frozen, the valve gears rusted tight, and the whole heap's 10 tons of dead weight. Nobody's had one of these old iron dinosaurs turn a wheel in 50 years. You can't run it, you can't sell it, and you can't hardly move it. You didn't buy an engine, old-timer, you bought 10 tons of pig iron. And you paid $50 to haul it home when I'd have run the whole thing across my scale and paid you for the weight. He coined the name right there, loud enough to carry, the old man's white elephant. And it stuck for the rest of that month, because a great dead gray machine nobody could move or use was exactly what those old words had always meant. The crowd laughed because Dale laughed, the way a crowd does. Harlan stood through it without a change in his face, his hands folded quiet in front of him, and let the laughter pass, the way weather passes a man who has decided to stand in it. Now, if you have ever watched a quiet, capable man get talked over by a loud one, if you have ever known somebody whose skill the world leaned on when it needed something heavy set right and forgot the rest of the time, then you already understand what this channel is about, and you might take a second to subscribe, because the people who stay for stories like Harlan's are who Iron Hook Stories was built for. Harlan said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that work does not answer to noise. What Dale Carrick could not have known, grinning behind his cigar, was that Harlan had stood in front of that dead machine with a lifetime of the engine trade awake in him. The crowd saw a filthy heap against a fence. Harlan saw the engine, under the grime, the bedplate cast heavy and true by a real hand, the cylinder bored deep and clean, the crosshead ways fitted finer than any ordinary mill engine ever needed, the governor and the valve gear cut with a care no jobbing shop ever bothered with. This was a builder's engine, not a catalog machine poured out by the hundred. Above all, he knew that a proud old engine builder who made a thing like this almost always cast his own name into the bedplate where the rust would swallow it, and that a careful engineer kept the maker's papers in the belly of the machine where no stranger would ever reach. Harlan knew the difference between a scrap engine and a great one somebody had let die. And what he found that night would strike a forgotten name, and the record of the mill that engine had turned in back into a history that had struck them both out. Harlan had come up hard. He went into the engine rooms young, apprenticed to an old stationary engineer, learning the cylinders and the valve gears and the long, patient feel of a machine until a dead engine came alive and ran sweet and true under the hand. His wife Della had died after a long illness, and they had buried no family of their own. And after she was gone, he lived alone in a small house behind his old shed with his rows of tools and his quiet. The town had a use for his hauling and no use at all for his hands. He knew that. A man who had set the running of 100 great engines could no more walk past a builder's engine going for scrap than walk past his own past, so he bid, because he had seen that somebody built it to hold the thing that mattered most. If you've made it this far into Harlan Voss's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. He let them sell the rest of the salvage first, the line shafting and the belt pulleys and the boxed mill tools knocked down to the pickers, while Harlan waited by the fence beside the towering dead engine. When the auctioneer finally came to it and called for a bid, Dale glanced up, called out his joke, and not one other hand went up. Harlan raised one finger, and the gavel came down at $50. He paid cash, signed the slip, and arranged to bring a lowboy trailer and a crane and a crew around at the end of the day, because a stationary engine was a killing thing to move whole. The story got around the town before Harlan's trailer was off the county road. By Monday, people who had not spoken 20 words to him in years stopped him outside the feed store to ask, grinning, whether he was going to stand his white elephant up in the yard to get his $50 back. Bud Ashby, who ran the feed store counter, said it plainer that there was nothing to a dead mill engine but rust and a hernia and no work left alive in it to turn. Harlan was buying a case of penetrating oil, a set of fine files and bearing scrapers, and a box of clean rag, and did not look up. "We'll see," he said, and that was the whole of his answer. He had spent a life learning that a machine is either a maker's or it isn't, and the noise a crowd makes has nothing to do with which. But Harlan did not open the engine up in the daylight, with the picker's truck still on the lot and Dale holding court by the auction table. He waited until the place had emptied out and he had the great machine home, craned down off the lowboy, and stood square in his shed under a single work lamp, and went at it alone that night, after the town had gone quiet. He did not tear into it. He knew that a machine like this keeps its truth deep in the iron, and that you reach those places slowly. the way you reach into anything a careful hand once closed up. He wiped the grime back off the bedplate a hand's width at a time and worked the seized flywheel until it broke loose and turned, and freed the frozen piston rod until the motion moved again under his hand. And when he ran his palm down the flank of the bedplate below the cylinder, he stopped. Because there was a raised shape in the casting under the filth that was not the rough scale of foundry leaves where no eye falls, and low on the hollow bed a bolted handhold cover met the iron with a fit and a finish that made no sense, unless it was holding what lay behind it. Down at the feed store they were still asking if he had sold his white elephant for the weight yet. Harlan wiped the raised shape clean with his thumb and began to back out the bolts on the cover that shut the belly of the machine where the world would never look. The engine had its own long, hard history, and the town had let it go for scrap without once asking after it. It ran back to the man who built it, a self-taught American engine builder of no fame in his own time, named Thaddeus Orne, who had learned the founding and fitting trade alone in a river iron town shop in an age when the big engine works already had the trade sewn up. And it ran back to the one mill that engine was built to turn, the Whitcomb Mill, a small one-family mill in a hard-luck county whose engineer had ordered this great machine for the works he meant to run a lifetime. Orne built and finished it far beyond any ordinary order, because he meant once to build the best thing he was capable of. But the small mills went under in the hard years when the cheap current and the packaged motor emptied the steam trade, and Orne's own works was wound up so completely that his very name was struck from the trade's register. And the engine stood on in that mill until the shop was condemned and torn down, no one remembering that a great builder had made it, or that a working engineer had run honest iron under it. And tucked in the belly of the machine behind the handhold cover, wrapped in oilcloth, lay Orne's own original works ledger page and a bill of lading for this exact engine. Folded in with a bundle of letters and a worn engine room log kept by the last man who ran it, an engineer named Ezra Whitcomb, whose mill the county condemned and tore down, and whose name the rolls struck out along with the shops, so that the man who had turned honest iron under that engine for 40 years was the one most thoroughly erased. The maker himself died poor and unknown, his finest work sealed up around a dead mill's own papers and a struck-out engineer's own hand. What none of them ever asked was what becomes of the record a dying mill trusts to its engine, and the name of the man who ran it, when both the works and the maker are forgotten. The answer had been leaning against the salvage fence the whole time, shut in the belly of a $50 engine nobody wanted. Harlan got the handhold cover off a little after midnight, the last bolt backed out, and in the iron dark of the bed sat an oilcloth bundle a stranger would have passed 1,000 times and never felt. He drew it out, and the old wrapping came open with a soft, dry crackle, a lifetime in the waiting, and he laid it open under the lamp. There was a heavy works ledger sheet gone amber with age and, folded around it, a thick bundle of letters and a worn log book. Harlan lifted them out, and when he had the ledger sheet open and read the fine, sure hand that had ruled and entered every line of it, he set it down and stood very still. This was the maker's own works record. The builder's private account of every engine he ever cast and shipped, and this engine's own entry stood there in the column, its works number and the name of the mill it was built for entered plain, and folded with it was the bill of lading for this exact machine. The crated cylinder and flywheel and bedplate billed out by rail to the Whitcomb mill the year it was set. And the letters and the log, in another blunt, careful hand, were Ezra Whitcomb's, the engineer writing to Orne the season he bought the engine new and swore he would run it honest, and 40 years on, an engine room log kept to the week the county came to condemn the mill, a working man setting down the plain truth of what his works had been in a town about to forget he had ever turned a wheel. In it, but the papers and the log were only half of it. Harlan went back to the bedplate now, drawing the small lamp in close along the casting below the cylinder, and there, cast proud into the iron under the grime where only a maker's eye would ever catch it, was the builder's own cast name plate, Thaddeus Orne's name and his river iron town raised in the metal. And beneath it, the works number the trade had only ever half believed was real, a great one of a kind engine, the only one of its pattern the man ever finished. And that number matched the entry in the works ledger, line for line, and matched the bill of lading made out to the Whitcomb mill. Harlan sat down on his shed stool and understood that the white elephant the town had laughed at for a month was a rare, complete, one-of-a-kind maker's stationary steam engine by a great forgotten builder. Museum grade to anyone who knew that name, worth a small fortune to a collector or a steam show restorer, and worth far more than money as the keeper of a lost mill's own papers and a hand. Of an engineer, the record had struck out. The next morning, Harlan did not call a scrapyard, and did not run the bedplate across the crusher for the iron, and did not cut the machine down into one of those rustic yard ornaments or a novelty flywheel table for his own shed, and a few in town thought him a fool a second time. He let them. He had spent one whole month being the man who paid $50 for a white elephant, and he did not mind being thought a fool by people who had never once been right about the thing in front of them. He carried the cast name plate and the works ledger and the letters to a steam preservation museum and engineers society and to a county archivist who knew what a maker's own works record and a struck name meant, and set himself to the harder thing, to strike a forgotten builder's name and a struck-out engineer's name back into the record that had dropped them both, and to find what family Ezra Whitcomb had left. The curator, a woman long among old iron, went very still over the cast plate and said quietly that a documented one of a kind engine by that builder, its works number matched to his ledger and the bill of lading, was the kind of thing a museum waits a lifetime for, and had all but given up as gone, and that the man who cast it had been no failed country tinkerer at all, but exactly the kind of overlooked master the record is supposed to keep, and had simply lost. And Ezra Whitcomb had descendants in the country still, a grandson 2 counties over among them, a gray man who had grown up on a scrap of family talk that some old grandfather had had a mill that got tore down and never spoke of it again, a story the family told as an old sadness and mostly let go. Harlan went to him that fall with the letters and the log opened to the last week in that blunt hand, and watched him read his own grandfather's world across the years, the plain, honest account he had set down of the works the season it was condemned. The man put a hand flat on the table and went quiet. They had grown up thinking their old engineer had been shut down under some cloud the family did not name. The ledger and the log told them instead that he had run the mill honest to the last week and been failed only by a trade that could no longer feed a one-family works and a town that struck his name out with the building. The grandson asked why he had troubled to come so far to give a struck-out stranger's family back their grandfather's name, Harlan said only that a maker casts his name into the iron where the rust will swallow it because he needs to believe somebody will someday come who can find it, so that being forgotten can never be the same as never having turned the wheel at all, and that he had nobody of his own to leave a thing to, so he had brought the Lost Mills record and a struck-out man's own hand home to the people they were always meant for. There was one thing more Harlan did before the engine left his shed, and he did it for the maker, and for the engineer, and for no one else. He restored it to slow careful way over a season of nights, cleaned a lifetime of rust and grime from every face of the iron, freed the seized flywheel and the frozen piston, trued the worn bearings, reset the sprung valve gear and the hunting governor until the great machine would draw over top center and turn again dead true the way it had in the mill, not to make a show of it, but because an engine a great maker had poured his life into deserved to do the one true thing it was made to do. He did not run the bedplate across the crusher, and did not cut the machine down into a yard ornament or a novelty lamp, because using a rare maker's engine for scrap or a curiosity was the very thing that had nearly killed it, and there was no truth in it. So on the last night, with the museum's people coming in the morning, Harlan set his shoulder to the barring lever and brought the great flywheel up over the top, and the engine turned, one long true revolution, the crank swinging round and the crosshead sliding sweet and square in its ways, the first the machine had moved in 50 years. And then he stilled it and let it stand quiet again. That part was never the point. He had made it whole again so that the man who cast it and the engineer whose life it had carried would be seen one time by somebody who finally understood what they were. That fall the engine went where it belonged, into a steam preservation museum and engineers' society, with the maker's name read clear at last, and his rare one-of-a-kind machine named beside it. And the Whitcomb Mills name was struck back into the county rolls it had been dropped from, and Ezra Whitcomb's name written in beside it as the engineer who ran honest iron under that engine to the end, generations late, so the family that had thought their old man shut down under a cloud knew at last that he had kept faith to the last week. Word of it went around the town the same as the laughter had, only quieter, and the people who had called Harlan a fool let the name the old man's white elephant drop, and did not pick it up again. Dale Carrick was not run out of business and was not made a villain. He was simply a man who had laughed loud at a thing he never bothered to look inside. And the next time he held court by the auction table the others did not lean in so far. Being right was the whole of what Harlan had wanted, and it had brought a great forgotten maker's name and a struck-out engineer's name back out of the rust. The museum kept the engine where the town could see it. They stood the great machine square on its bedplate in the middle of the front hall under a soft light, the iron cleaned and waxed dark, and the bright work trued to a soft gray shine. The flywheel free and the motion set, and a card beside it showing how the belly of the machine had kept its papers. The rare one-of-a-kind engine of a great forgotten builder. Cast for a mill that went dark in a hard season and restored to the maker's name at last, and tucked in its bed the original works ledger and the bill of lading and the log of the engineer, Ezra Whitcomb, whom the record had struck out and this machine had kept. And on a still evening that next spring, the light going gold through the tall front windows, Harlan Voss drove over to look in on it. And there in the last of the sun stood the engine, whole and cleaned and seen at last, the iron glowing soft, where a stranger's hands had finally reached it. Harlan was 73 years old, A man the auction had laughed at one whole month, and he stood quiet a long moment and laid one broad, scarred hand flat on the cool iron of the bed beside the maker's cast name and nodded once. The way a man nods at a job that was done right. The work had said it for him, the way work always did. A maker casts his own name into the iron the rust will swallow, and an engineer tucks a lost mill's papers in the belly of the engine he ran, trusting somebody will come who can read what their hands made and set turning true. So that being forgotten for a lifetime can never be the same as never having turned the wheel at all, and a town rarely knows what greatness or whose good name was left to rust at its own fence line until somebody troubles to open the thing they laughed at. So I'll leave it to you. Was Harlan Voss right to give the engine to a museum under the maker's name and carry a struck-out engineer's papers home to strangers without keeping any of it for himself? Or was that one decency too far, in a world that had laughed at him for nothing? Tell me which one in the comments, and I'll read them.